Hi everyone, this is David J. Kent, and this week, in celebration of the release of my new book, Lincoln in New England, In Search of His Forgotten Tours, I'm going through a series of videos just to give some background on Lincoln's relationship with each of the 6 New England states. So one state per video, and we're going to talk about Connecticut in this video, and this is the last of the 6. So Lincoln, of course, went to New England twice in his lifetime, and it was on the second trip in 1860 that he spent about 5 days total in Connecticut. He spoke at Hartford, New Haven, Meriden, Norwich, and Bridgeport. He also made about a 3-hour stop in New London where he didn't give any speech. A lot of these, at least for the first 3, Hartford, New Haven, and Meriden, were prearranged when he was still in New York to give the Cooper Union speech. Those people were reached out to him and they set up these. But the others, Norwich and Bridgeport and the stop in New London, they were added even after Lincoln was in New Hampshire. So some of the key people that are in Connecticut. Uh, Modern day person, Michael Burlingame. He is lives in Mystic. He taught in New London for many years, and then after retiring, actually has been teaching for the last 15 or so years out in the University of Illinois Springfield. So he keeps pretty busy. Now back then, there were some important people that lived or worked at least part time in Connecticut. Two of the people whose names you should know are Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn and many other books. They both lived in Hartford at one point, and on this tours that I did, I stopped into the Mark Twain house, and right next door is the Harriet Beecher Stowe house. So they are pretty important in Hartford. In fact, on the river walk along the river that goes through Hartford, there is a series of Lincoln related statues, and one of them has Harriet Beecher Stowe meeting Abraham Lincoln. So they were important to the area at least. Another person that really isn't from Connecticut, he's from Kentucky, is Cassius Marcellus Clay. He was a cousin of Henry Clay, Lincoln's beau ideal of a statesman. So Cassius Marcellus Clay was like Henry Clay, was from Kentucky, and like Henry Clay, he was a slaveholder. But he became pretty ardent abolitionist, and he traveled throughout New England and other places around the country. But during this period, he traveled throughout New England, giving speeches in favor of abolitionist movement and anti-slavery, and speaking out for Republicans. In fact, he was the very first person, after giving a speech in favor of William Buckingham, which we'll come to back to in a second, to experience the very first 5 people that would later make up the Wide Awakes. And I'll talk about them again in a minute. Another important person in Connecticut is a guy by the name of Nehemiah D. Sperry. He was a Republican state committee chair. He helped organize a lot of the stops in Connecticut. He had been Connecticut Secretary of State from 1855 to 57. And Lincoln actually appointed him in 1861 to be postmaster of New Haven. And he was there from 1861 through several presidents to 1886. He was pretty important in Connecticut. Another interesting guy is Julius Eggleston. And he's important for a couple of reasons. One, because he was the one that was sent by Nehemiah Sperry to kind of shuttle Lincoln around in his 3-hour stop in New Haven when he was moving from Meriden and actually New Haven to Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and back. He stopped in New London. And Julius Eggleston was the person that was supposed to meet him, and he got there a little late. He had to track him down on the street. But then he shuttled in all of these local people to meet Lincoln while he was getting lunch before getting back to the train station. He's important partially for that, but partially because his son, Percy Coe Eggleston, in the 1920s wrote a very short, very thin biography of Lincoln's time in New England. In fact, he called it Lincoln in New England, which is what the title of my book is called, Lincoln in New England. So that's why he's important. Now, there's another guy who's important in Connecticut is that you've probably heard of. His name is Gutzon Borglum. He's the sculptor, and mostly he had a studio in Stamford, which is kind of on the southern coast of Connecticut, down towards New York. He became a sculptor, and he has a couple of famous things. He's probably the most famous for this huge head of Abraham Lincoln that sits in the Capitol, but also of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Teddy Roosevelt in Mount Rushmore. He was a Connecticut guy, or at least he lived in Connecticut for a while. Another guy who was interesting is P.T. Barnum, the circus guy and the sideshow guy. He was the mayor and a big benefactor of Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is the last stop on Lincoln's tour. He spoke in Bridgeport before heading home. And then while Lincoln was in the White House, P.T. Barnum brought Tom Thumb and his wife on their wedding tour after they just got married to Washington and to the White House to meet with Lincoln. So there's a couple other politicians that are pretty important to Lincoln in Connecticut. So one is William Buckingham, who I mentioned before. He was a governor. He had been for a couple of years, and he was seeking re-election. And he would win a few more times during the Civil War. And he was a big war governor. In Connecticut, like Massachusetts and many of these other places, you had to run for governor every year. So it wasn't a long term, it was just 1 year terms. So Lincoln meets up with William Buckingham in Hartford. He goes and he speaks on behalf of Buckingham, but also kind of repeating his main points of his Cooper Union speech. And then they get into a carriage and they head back to where they're staying, where Lincoln is staying. And I mentioned before the Wide Awakes with Cassius Clay. They were just the first 5 people who that evening had just decided, yeah, let's dress up like, almost like soldiers with little capes and torches, and we'll just kind of walk along with Cassius Clay's carriage. Well, a week later, when Lincoln is there, they had just the night before officially become the Wide Awake group. And now it's 50 people. And they're all dressed up. They're all now, it's much more uniformy. And they're carrying torches. And they surround Lincoln's carriage as they go away from the speech and escort him. They don't say anything. They just escort him. And Lincoln kind of looks at them like, this is strange. But the Wide Awakes became a huge supporting group for the Republican Party during the convention, during the campaign. They became hundreds of thousands in all the states across the North. So they got their start in Hartford, and Lincoln was the first guy to actually see them en masse after they first officially formed as the Wide Awake group. Now, another person, if I asked you, like, who's the most famous politician that you know of from Connecticut from that time period, you almost certainly would say Gideon Welles. Gideon Welles was at the time the editor of the Hartford Evening Press, the newspaper. He had been a Democrat at one point, but now he was a Republican by 1860. He had been the chief of the Bureau of Provision and Clothing for the U.S. Navy Department under James K. Polk in the 1840s. So he actually had a little bit of experience with the Navy when Lincoln made him the Secretary of the Navy. But he's in and out several times. He meets Lincoln during this trip. He also is a delegate to the Chicago Convention, and he's there and he's helping to get people to vote. Well, he actually votes for Chase. He says he voted for Chase out of duty. He just at the time thought that Chase was the better candidate, and so he voted for Chase. And I'll talk about the voting in a minute. But he also interestingly enough, played a key role in Lincoln's 1864 renomination and election, both in supporting Lincoln, but also blocking Chase, who was trying to, slide in and get the nomination instead of Lincoln. The Chases, both Chases, are very important during the course of the war for other reasons as well. Mrs. Wells had, and the family had lost 5 of their own children. Mrs. Wells was very helpful in comforting Mary Lincoln after the death of Willie in 1862, and then again right after the next day after Lincoln was assassinated, because she was very good dealing with that kind of grief since she had gone through it so many times on her own. Now, on all of these videos, I talk about, well, what did these New England states do during the Republican convention? For Connecticut, they had 12 votes, and on the first ballot, they gave 7 to Edward Bates from Missouri. But they did give 2 to Lincoln. They also gave 2 to Chase. They gave 1 to Cameron. Now, on the second ballot, they shifted a little bit. Bates only had 4, and Lincoln was up to 4 himself. Again, 2 for Chase, 2, and then 2 for Henry Clay. On the third ballot, it stayed fairly much the same. Bates got 4, Lincoln got 4, Chase got 2, and remember, Wells was voting for Chase. But now Clay only had 1 instead of 2, and one of those stray votes for Clay shifted over kind of on the third ballot for William Seward. It was kind of like throw the guy a bone, because by this time Lincoln had caught up to him and passed him, and it was clear that Lincoln was going to be the nominee. So that's Connecticut, and in these videos I've talked about all of the 6 New England states. And when you look back at the information and look back at how important some of these people were, and look back at the voting in the convention and then during the election itself, Lincoln's tour of New England, especially the 1860 tour, not so much the earlier 1848 tour, but especially the 1860 tour, did seem to help his chances of getting the nomination and getting elected. Seward, right next door in New York, he counted on all of New England just supporting him from the beginning, and that's not what happened. Maine and New Hampshire supported Lincoln right from the beginning, and Vermont was in the second ballot, shifted everything to Lincoln. The other states gave more or less to Lincoln during the course of the voting, and of course they kind of went first, so they kind of gave the tacit permission for other states to shift over, especially after Lincoln became clear that Lincoln was the clear alternative to Seward, and there were people looking for alternatives to Seward. So these people in New England were very important, and the fact that Lincoln had just been touring 3 of the states in New England and passed through Massachusetts also on his way really did help, because these are the same people, the same political people in those states who were at the convention and doing the voting. They were the delegates. They remembered him because it had only been 2 or 3 months since he had been there. And they remembered him, and they said, yeah, we were pretty impressed with this guy. And when it became clear he was an alternative and the others weren't, they all voted for him. So these trips were very important to his time in getting elected, and during the course of the war, as we saw. So that's the last video. Please take a look back at all 6 videos. You don't have to necessarily do them in order, but look at all the videos and you can see how important New England was to Lincoln. So thanks very much for listening.